Okay, so this is from the introduction to the book, and it sort of talks about how I came to write the book. When I first started to work as a TV critic in 2000, it was probably the best time to be writing about TV. And when I first started to work as a movie critic in 2004, it was probably the worst time to be writing about movies. I found myself spending hours in the dark consuming toxic doses of superhero movies, wedding-themed romantic comedies, crypto-fascist paeans to war, and bromances about unattractive, immature young men and the gorgeous young women desperate to marry them. Hardly any movies had female protagonists. Most actresses were cast to play the girl. The girl was the adult version of the princess. As a kid, I'd believed the princess was the protagonist because she'd seemed the most central to the story. The word protagonist comes from the Greek for the leading actor in a contest or cause, and a protagonist is a person who wants something and does something to get it. The girl doesn't act, though. She behaves. She has no cause but a plight. She doesn't want anything. She's wanted. She isn't a winner. She's won. She doesn't self-actualize, but aids the hero in self-actualization. Sometimes I'd sit in the theater and feel mounting despair and think, why do you keep telling me this? Why are you talking to me this way? Of course there were good movies that reconnected me to myself and to the world, but most of the time I felt like some half-mad ethnographer, lost in another dimension, frantically gathering field notes from inside this dark mirror in which I couldn't for the life of me locate myself. I began to feel unreal, peripheral in my own life, trapped in a dream not my own. I felt like a canary in a coal mine, bearing traumatized witness to the inhumanity of the tentpole threequel, chirping my tiny, impotent protests into the dark void. I felt, I guess, like Alice in Wonderland. It helped to take notes for some reason. I wrote things down to assuage the bricked-in, bloodied fingernailed feeling of despair that sometimes came over me, to assert my existence, to remind myself to buy bananas on the way home. I filled notebook after notebook with loopy, illegible scrawls of outrage. I know everybody says their handwriting is loopy and illegible, but mine really was because I wrote in the dark.
Thank you. So, Carina, I think what I'm going to do is give you the few questions, and the book is so fertile, and there's so many conversations I wish we could have. I'm just going to throw out the 3 questions to you, and then you kind of tackle them as you wish.
Okay.
So the first is this sort of sense of writing in the dark. I can feel your anger and anxiety at being saturated with the power of these deeply sexist images and scripts in your work. As a well-known TV and film critic who has to do it, right? Mm-hmm. Who has to sit, get the sense.
I couldn't leave.
You could not leave, like some of us could be. Through that last line, is this a book, a way that you're writing yourself out of the dark, right? That's one thing.
Yeah. Well, I definitely, and that didn't really become clear to me until I was finishing it. But I wasn't prepared for how visceral the feeling would be of like having, we talk about reclaiming narratives and stuff, but I was like, I just reclaimed my narrative. I wasn't really even conscious of doing it as I was doing it. And it just started to build on itself. So, and it also, the whole idea of lightness and dark is that I looked into, I sort of used my feelings of discomfort and of cognitive dissonance as sort of like the thing that I was attracted to, the sort of thing that led me down the rabbit holes. Yeah. And I had to do a lot of research into what was happening at the time. Like, even though I was there, and because I go back to like my childhood, mm-hmm. I was there, but I wasn't really aware of what was going on, as a little kid. And so when I started to investigate, well, what was it like in the, when I was in kindergarten in 1973, like what was the world like? It shed a light on a world that I guess I didn't realize was the way that it was.
Yeah, okay, thank you. You pick up in the title of your book, Play That Girl, which mm-hmm. You suggest, it comes from Isla Fisher's, right, moment, where she gets also, that becomes clickbait for a lot, she gets a lot of flack for even offering that critique, really that's for the scripts that I have, you play that girl mm-hmm.
For
women in Hollywood, which I hope is rather well known. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, for one thing, I was I was a film critic at the LA Times, so not only was I a film critic at a major paper at a time that was particularly bad for women in Hollywood, this is around 2007, but I was at the hometown newspaper. Right. So I remember like sometimes feeling like seeing something and thinking, oh no, I don't like this. Oh no, do I have to say, and worrying about it. So I remember like when she made that comment, and it was to an Australian newspaper. She's Australian, so I don't know. I think she kind of made it at home, and then suddenly it was all over the internet, and as clickbait, and as like my favorite headline was, she's married to Sacha Baron Cohen, and. So the headline was, Borat's babe plans sex revolution. And I remember just like that instant backlash really, not only did I understand what she was talking about, but it validated my nervousness, and I sort of saw exactly what I had been afraid of reflected in that. And then a couple months later, it happened to Katherine Heigl, like much worse. And my theory is that part of the reason she got it a lot worse was because she wasn't married to Sacha Baron Cohen, who at the time was extremely powerful, and he had Borat, and he had like the biggest comedies.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Could you say a little bit more? I think this notion comes out a bit later, which follows that when you mention that girl, which is this question of feminist grief.
Well, I think that. Like I said, what led me was sort of my curiosity about like why do I feel so uncomfortable, or what is this cognitive dissonance, or why do all the messages seem so mixed? Why is just this idea of like what it means to be a girl or a woman in this society feel so confusing? And I think that something that happens to a lot of people is once you start to really think about it or investigate it or try to figure it out, you come face to face. It's kind of like the Matrix, like there's a moment where you're just like, oh no, this is another reality than what I was told. And I think that that's definitely true of anyone, I would say, of my generation or younger. Like, I think my generation, I'm like Gen X person, and I think that it's significant because, well, I thought that I was like, oh, I'm the first post-feminist generation. But then I realized, Katharine Hepburn thought she was part of the first post-feminist generation, and she was born before my grandmother was born. Like, this is something that kind of goes in circles.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to have our next reading.
Oh, yes. Okay. So I'm going to read from a chapter called Bunnies. And it's about, it's my grandfather was, a very Mad Men kind of guy. And he collected Playboys, and he had them leather bound by year in these tomes that looked like encyclopedias in his very like swanky card poker table room. Anyway, so we used to steal them and look at them when we were kids. But they were very out in the open. It was just part of his whole identity. Playboy pictorials were all culture, no nature. All those gauzy photos of naked girls alone in their kitschy rooms with their props and their yarn ribbon pigtails, like mine, had a strangely static and hermetic quality that made the girl's nakedness look somehow artificial. They made me think of the taxidermied animals at the Natural History Museum in Chicago and New York. It was like they were specimens, more lifelike than alive. That they were stripped of their clothes didn't bother me as much as that they were stripped of all context. They were isolated and frozen in time. Even the outdoor shots seemed to be taken behind glass. The girls' accompanying biographical squibs only added to this impression, resembling the plaques next to museum dioramas, detailing an extinct animal's name, geographic provenance, statistics, height, weight, bust, waist, and hip measurements, and dietary patterns and mating behaviors, or turn-ons and turn-offs. The Playboy collection was a museum of girls, a taxonomy of girls. The pictures fascinated me and filled me with ontological terror at the same time. I knew, because everybody knew, that only girls were sexy, and that sexiness was girls. It was exclusively female. This confused me, so I kept going back to the magazines trying to figure it out. It made me uncomfortable in ways I couldn't begin to express. The model's aura of stuffed bunny obliviousness, by the way, was precisely the vibe Playboy was going for. In 1967, Hugh Hefner told the Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci that he'd called the models bunnies because the rabbit, the bunny in America, has a sexual meaning. This is a quote. And I chose it because it's a fresh animal, shy, vivacious, jumping, sexy. First it smells you, then it escapes, then it comes back, and you feel like caressing it, playing with it. A girl resembles a bunny, joyful, joking. Consider the kind of girl we made popular, the Playmate of the Month. She is never sophisticated, a girl you cannot really have. She is a young, healthy, simple girl, the girl next door. We are not interested in the mysterious, difficult woman, the femme fatale who wears elegant underwear with lace, and she is sad and somehow mentally filthy. The Playboy girl has no lace, no underwear. She is naked, well-washed, with soap and water, and she is happy. That's Hugh Hefner talking to Oriana. I didn't read this as a kid, of course, but I still think the message got across. Playboy's idea of woman was a naked fairy tale princess, a young, dumb, defenseless, trusting, easily manipulated woodland creature. She gave herself entirely because she was too inexperienced to know any better. She was a fresh animal, well-washed with soap and water. She could not learn, grow, or change. She could not really exist in a temporal sense. All she could do was try to preserve and display herself. Experience made her difficult. It got her banished to her witchy cottage in the forest. She had to remain a dumb bunny, an unconscious body, frozen in time and preserved in amber, for as long as she could, in order to survive. The sexy lady is the only kind of lady that openly exists in the sunshine of the symbolic realm. She's the only kind of lady that warrants being looked at, paid attention to, or acknowledged. In order to be listened to, a lady should be nice to look at. There should be no doubt as to her sexual desirability, but this will undermine her argument, no matter how sophisticated. We are not interested in sadness, sophistication, or experience. We secretly believe that female subjectivity is filth.
Aha. So I think there's a suggestion of nasty women,
Very
right?
nasty.
Very nasty, and that sort of nastiness has to be erased in this sort of incredibly telling and odd construction of animal freshness, right? As sort of symbolized by the bunny. So I was interested in the quote, the response to Oriana Fallaci of Hefner's sort of discussion of we're not really interested in the femme fatale, right? Somehow that's the, and I think he ends it with saying somehow that is, they're mentally filthy. So that's what I hooked on. I was like, mentally filthy.
As opposed to well-washed.
So a woman who is taking her own sexual agency in some kind of autonomous sense, right? And breaking, obviously, the sort of notion of clean sex and clean sort of heterosexuality, right? So there's something about, I just have this flicker of that moment when Trump says, nasty woman, right, at the podium, which to me suggests there was just a connection I had about this notion of kind of filth and autonomy, you know, sort of sexual autonomy for women. So
no, absolutely, and I think that it's not just, interestingly though, it's not just sexual autonomy, it's any kind of experience. Yeah. It's like, and that's why, you know, I think when Trump said it to Hillary, or when he's talking to Oriana Fallaci or whatever, he's talking about, we don't want smart, sophisticated, experienced people. That's sad and that's filthy, and he sexualizes the filthiness.
At the heart of that is the sexuality.
Yeah, it's sexualized, but I don't, you know, it's interesting. I don't know if he's talking about sexuality. He's just sexualizing her adulthood and making it bad. Like he's saying, young, innocent sexuality is good, but you can't grow. You can't grow up.
So it's about power and autonomy.
It's about power.
It's really about power. And of course, I think you talk about it too, the sort of Gloria Steinem's sort of famous moment of being the Playboy Bunny, right?
Or going undercover.
Going undercover and doing that work.
Work that they called at the time the best job in America for a young girl, and she did that expose.
Very famously, So sort of shifting gears a little bit and not out of the part that you read, but what I love with what you did with the bunnies right, apart from this, and then having a discussion about Steinem, is that you have this wonderful discussion about Bugs Bunny. And what you do with Bugs Bunny is that you desire him as a child, and you desire for him, her, them. Right? There's something transgendered about your desire. Could you? So I want to sort of queer this up a little bit, right?
So Bugs Bunny, I had a crush on, and I found him very sexually like appealing, as whatever he was, a boy.
A girl.
But then sometimes he would put on a dress, like that was his bit. He loved, cross-dressing, and he would put on these amazing disguises, and they were extremely performative, feminine disguises, right? He would be like Carmen Miranda and the Bobby Soxer and the ballet dancer. It was always something very performative. And he usually did it to like escape with his life, right? He would basically seduce the hunter or the maestro or some other autocratic, bully or whatever, and then use their use their attraction to him as a girl against them to escape. And I loved him both ways. I thought it was obviously like this. He was obviously performing sexuality as a girl, but he was also just he was a very gender fluid kind of. And I think that little girls, I think a lot of little girls have like one of my first huge crushes after that was David Bowie. I think that there is a huge tradition of that, especially with little girls, because you start out liking young boys, and they're more fluid seeming.
Yeah, so sort of Adrienne Rich's sort of famous essay, right, on compulsory heterosexuality, for instance, kind of goes from that in some ways. So so one of the things that Carina does so beautifully is you sort of the bunny chapter, for instance, sort of you're given an extraordinary sort of illuminating set of analysis, and then she makes this sort of counterintuitive move and gives you another set of stories. So the book is sort of surprise after surprise, and it's great fun.
It's also grouped, at the time of my life. So I was probably 6, 7 years old when we were stealing the Playboys, and that's when I was watching cartoons. And so it's sort of like I tried to just go back to specific times and to really look at everything that I was looking at.
And also the way that you start the book, and she sort of, in some sense, is threaded through the book, is your daughter.
Yeah.
Right? It's sort of starting your daughter watching Sleeping Beauty.
Yes.
Right? And then how you also, it's not just about your daughter, it's also about your great-grandmother in Peru. Right? And that wonderful picture you have at the end.
Who looks exactly like my daughter, by the way.
Exactly right. Sort of what are the, what are the sort of these cyclical kind of and dominant and transnational kind of ideals of the feminine, the sexual, that connect across generations, right? I thought that was really beautiful and powerful in the way you did it.
Thank you. Also, one of the reasons I included the picture of my great-grandmother is it's 1906, and she's dressed just like a Victorian girl, right? And she has, and I'd written a lot about Alice in Wonderland, and when I looked at the picture, she's dressed a lot like her. She has the same hairstyle exactly, and it just really impressed me that. And she looks very angry in the picture, and she's just sort of like loaded down in lace and frills, and she's just like, ah. So I thought it was really funny because she just looks like someone who's just made to play this part and is not at all happy.
Not at all happy to be in that studio, and it's like 1906 in Lima,
that studio,
right?
like hot and covered in scratchy lace.
So I want to jump off Alice a little bit, because Alice also is a leitmotif in the book, and she's so fabulous, right? So could you speak a little bit about how Alice emerges for you as almost an alter ego? Or is that, I don't know, is that the correct psychoanalytic term? I don't know. But I love Alice. I have a whole kind of love affair with Alice in Wonderland, but more as a post-colonial sort of, I think of the brown Alice coming down the rabbit hole. There are many rabbit holes that one has come down.
Many.
So many rabbit holes. I love that, that moment again for that reason and more, and because she is so iconic. Could you say a little bit about how?
I was just at the bookstore one day and saw this really nice edition of it, and I decided it just sort of spoke to me. And I realized that I'd never read it before, and I'd never, and that as a child, I hadn't really liked the Disney version, the cartoon version. And that I had liked when I was little, there was only the first three, Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, and Snow White. The triumvirate. And so I ended up trying to read it to my daughter, who was obsessed with Sleeping Beauty, and she hated it. And then I realized I hated it too. I hated her too. I didn't like her, but I went and read it and found that I felt like her experience reflected my experience in pop culture and as a critic, and going down these rabbit holes and going into these nonsensical worlds where there was no reason and nothing made sense, and you were just being gaslighted constantly, and nothing you did was, you're too big, you're too small, you're too loud, you're too rude, you're too this, you cry too much, you talk too much, you complain too much, you eat too much, whatever, all the. So I was like, wow, like I had never realized. And then I thought, it's really funny that as little girls, we're really, trained to love these princess characters like Sleeping Beauty, who are very unconscious most of the time, who are like asleep most of the time. And we really like them because they're pretty and they're quiet and docile and passive. And we're already kind of predisposed to think Alice is rude and she talks too much. And she goes up against people and she questions them and she challenges them and she criticizes them, and it was like, I think we really very early on were told that is not a good way to be. That's right. And nobody likes her. So I suddenly felt, I've identified with her, but I identified with her in my 40s, and I hadn't liked her. And then when I mentioned it to my mom, she's like, oh yeah, I never liked her either when I was little. I think it's that unconscious, all the people, I'm a big fan of Hillary Clinton's, but all the people would say I just don't like her and I don't know why, and you're like, I know why. I know you don't realize why, but I know why.
But this notion of, that Alice is not nice. And that Alice, you don't like her. This notion of sort of niceness and this idea of the having to be liked, right, is so much a part of dominant femininity, I think.
And then she's curious, that she has a lot of agency, that she's led by her own curiosity, and that she wants things. Like she goes to the table with the Mad Hatter and she sits down and she's like, they're like, there's no room, and she's like, yes, there is. This is a big empty table, and I'm hungry, And it's like, and they're like, do you want some wine? Okay. Oh, there's no wine. And then she gets angry with them. So this is not a character that, this is not something that Sleeping Beauty or Snow White does. Snow White just breaks into your house and cleans it.
While Alice is saying, I have my appetites, I want to eat and drink.
Exactly.
No, wonderful. So we will move on to your next excerpt.
Oh, okay. Which is, so this is from the late 90s. I went to an academic conference that was the first ever academic conference, first and last, I think. That's great. It was on pornography, but it was an academic conference. So once in the late 90s, I spent 3 strange days hanging around the Sheraton Hotel in Universal City, which is not a city so much as an unincorporated area in Los Angeles County that houses Universal Studios and its attendant theme park, reporting on an event that billed itself as an academic conference on the First Amendment and pornography. I was there on assignment for Salon's then new, now dead, education section. The hook was that the conference was being co-sponsored by the Center for Sex and Gender Research at Cal State Northridge and something called the Free Speech Coalition, which turned out to be the lobbying arm of the adult entertainment industry. Having never attended an academic conference, I didn't know what to expect, but the mix yielded some highly amusing juxtapositions, some bordering on parody. Panels on Victorian pornography and erotic vases from ancient Greece were presented alongside chats with porn stars. My job, as I remember, was to soak in the ambiance, filter it through my disbelief, and report back in arch tones. The article would write itself. No doubt, my experience of the conference was filtered through a trifecta of inexperience, selective focus, and confirmation bias. But I was quickly struck by how hostile to inquiry for an event co-sponsored by a research center the conference seemed to be. To be honest, I don't recall attending any panels on Victorian pornography or ancient Greek vases, and maybe if I had, my one-sided experience would have been mitigated somehow. What I do recall, however, is that over the next few days, I found myself absorbing one unrelenting, expertly media-trained celebratory paean to commodified sex positivity after another, and feeling more and more depressed by the hour. The conference's best-known, most vocal attendants seemed to respond to all but the most ingratiating questions by invalidating them and then swiftly shaming the interlocutor. The porn stars stuck to their talking points and stayed on message. Liking sex was the preferred euphemism for making or consuming porn. Conversely, harboring even the slightest ambivalence about porn meant that you categorically hated sex and were out to ruin it for everyone else. A dominant narrative soon emerged in which pornography, and not the Victorian kind with the bloomers and the spankings, but the kind with the record-breaking gangbangs, was presented as a bastion of orgiastic disinhibition, a filthy fun-time Arcadia from which sprang nothing but joy and empowerment and marriage and children and unicorns. Like all good stories, this one had a villain, the sex-hating, man-foiling girlfriend whose cruel, withholding ways sent armies of disconsolate men into the tender embrace of their favorite porn stars daily. I was the girlfriend. Was I that girlfriend? I didn't feel like that person. But in this alternate universe, I undoubtedly was. I'd had an upsetting encounter with a boyfriend's porn stash recently, and I felt both upset and upset about being upset. In the late 90s, it was not cool to be upset about porn or sex work of any kind. In the shame hierarchy of the day, just as now, it felt much more shameful to feel bad about it in any way than to produce, distribute, or consume it. The more this version of reality was reiterated and reaffirmed throughout the event, the sadder, more isolated, and more diminished I felt. The worst thing about it was how totalizing the experience was and how deviant it made me feel.
So you open up the Pandora's box, right? So
I know,
even among academic feminists, we know what it's called the porn wars, right? The for and against, and the people kind of in between. And so I have to say, I kind of straddle the in between, right? Sort of been somewhat brought up with the work on sex positivity, right? Which you mentioned. So. And also interested in agency, right, of sex workers themselves. So within that, obviously, pornography is huge. So I read your critique very much as, because with the rest of the chapter, as a critique of commodification, sort of a saturated commodification of women's bodies and the mainstreaming, right, of a certain kind of dominant pornography. But anyway, a lot going on, and we had a conversation prior to this conversation, and I loved what you had to say about sort of the transactional and about sex and money. So
yeah,
you could say a little bit about that.
That's sort of, you know, in order to sort of find a through line for the book, in a way, like I said, I was sort of trying to find a context, like a historical context for my feelings. And, you know, and I just didn't want to say what I felt sort of happened to me at that conference, which was, you're not allowed to feel this way because I'm Susie Bright or Nina Hartley and I have agency and I produce these films and I'm sex positive and I'm a feminist. But really at the time, most of the stuff that was being produced was, I think, kind of like now, I don't know that much about it, but what was about, was like the sort of pro-am, you know, like sort of just people kind of like filtering through this business. And I remember just thinking like, somehow we seem to go from sort of slut shaming and women aren't allowed to have sex and have to be shamed for having sex, straight to transactional sex and performing for money and trading bodies for money, and like where somehow there was it never felt like the conversation about sex was very dominated by pornography and sex work, and I always felt like there was something missing in between.
The kind of middle zone and a middle road.
Because I feel like in order to really talk about sexuality and stuff, it's like we should be able to divorce money from it for like a second. You know, like let's just uncouple them for 1 second. And there was this sort of, you know, for me in researching the book, you know, a lot of the stuff that, you know, it's funny because I just read from the Playboy Bunny and then this, but most of it is about marriage, and it's about what it is, what you know it means to be a wife, and what the function of a wife is, and like economically too, like what. How the wife functions in the economy and stuff. So,
which is as?
Well, I mean, as dependent on this family unit, the sort of family wage that's brought home by a man.
As property.
As property.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, as a strange combination of property, you know, idealized idea, and servant, whatever. You know, so all the things together, but definitely contingent and dependent. And relational always. So I think that's what, you know, I was like, well, so in every sense, you know, as a wife, as a sexual being, as, you know, whatever, as a porn star, as a stripper, like it's always, you know, it was hard to find instances where what does it mean for a woman to be free and autonomous and self, you know, really in charge of herself.
Okay. Thank you. And so just sort of pushing on further around this sort of key question of sexualities and sexual agency or lack thereof in different ways, or all those things together. So the construction of what we call good girlism, right, sort of the good girl versus bad girl kind of paradigm is, I think, very much at the core of the nasty woman phenomenon, or, you know, the anger at that. I loved what you did in the book too with the other way that folks understand it, and which when you talk about sort of slut shaming, which is what's called the Madonna-Whore complex, right? So if you talk about the good girl, the ultimate bad girl, right, is the whore, right? And of course in South America and in Catholicism, that's, you know, Marianismo. Versus, but you do this sort of wonderful reading of it through Pretty Woman. But it, again, because this is a leitmotif in the book, could you just say a little bit about that?
It is a leitmotif in the book, and it's sort of reflected in a lot of things. Because one of the other leitmotifs is the angel in the house. So the idealized domestic goddess, you know, the 19th century domestic goddess, which still existed and was called the domestic goddess, you know, 100 years later. But it's interesting because in when I was reading about Playboy, I think Robin Morgan described the Playboy Bunny as the unbeatable Madonna-Whore combination, and so it had always been a, you know, this sort of either or, and like the good girl was the angel or was the pure, you know, virginal person, and then the whore was the sort of all bad, and that at some point in the mid-century, those things were combined as almost like as a consumer product. So, and I mean, you see this, like, I don't know if you see it so much right now, but you did see it up until like 10 years ago, you know, the whole thing about like Britney Spears being a virgin, but being so sexualized. It was like that weird thing of like, look at these virgins like grinding on stage. It's like, I'm so confused, you know?
Right.
So
difficult.
So that's, and I think that was like an interesting thing that Robin Morgan coined like in the 70s or the 60s, was that Hugh Hefner combined them. And that's what his Fresh Bunny is. It's the unbeatable Madonna-Whore combination. And that's a little bit where I also get into why I get with the porn thing, because it's like, I'm also really aware of that construction and how it seems like liberation, but it's tricky, you know? So I think I got off topic of your question, but...
No, I think my question was baggy enough. And that's what I hope, you know, because I think you can go in so many directions. I remember reading this wonderful essay by Sandra Cisneros. I think if I hope I'm pronouncing her last name, but a very, you know, really sort of brilliant and well-known Chicana author who talks about the Virgin of Guadalupe being the model for so many Latinas. And she has this really funny moment where she's like, it's a little difficult, right? Because on one hand, you have to be the angel mother, right? Ultimately, that's your goal, but you have to remain a virgin. And then when so many...
it's just starting with it's like the virgin mother is just like, okay.
Yeah, it's like...
I mean, talk about a mixed message.
Slightly difficult, right? But then how do you, if that is enshrined in a major religious tradition, then it's very difficult to question. And she does it with such beauty in this one essay on like, I'm going to remodel, with Guadalupe kind of as the paradigm, and I'm going to sort of invoke the indigenous, right, within the Madonna for Mexican tradition.
But it's just another form, I think, of the impossible paradigm, right?
Yeah, and the mixed message, right?
And the mixed message.
Yeah.
It's just the cultural gaslighting. Like it's literally impossible to be that. That is what you're aiming for. Like total head exploding impossibility, contradiction.
Yeah. And that messaging is from the word go.
From the word go. And what you were actually, I just remembered what you said about the good girlism. I mean, that's why I also talk so much about princess characters, because the princess character is the ultimate good girl, and most of the time she's either asleep or unconscious or locked up in a tower, or she's completely like has no agency and is just waiting. Is waiting for someone to
like Little Mermaid. I remember that was one of the last Disney cartoons I watched, which of course completely dates me. But I remember just being totally attracted to Ursula. But like in Little Mermaid, she has no voice, right? But it's also the construction of really evil, right?
Oh, well, yeah.
Of the evil woman, aka the nasty woman.
Well, like my daughter said to me when she was 6 years old, Mommy, why are the bad guys always girls? Because she only had seen, those were the only movies she wanted to watch, and the villains were always female.
Always female.
Always. And they were always older women. So again, like the Hillary thing. But like, it's always about, then later I read like Marina Warner, who writes about fairy tales. I think it was her, but she wrote about how the princess and the king, like the Ivanka Donald combo, are a dyad, and they're one thing, and the villain is the older woman, is the witch or the evil queen or the evil stepmother, and it has to do with experience. Like if the princess is brought back by the prince to the king's castle, she's just absorbed into that patriarchal structure, and the evil queen or the stepmother or the witch were always, for one thing, they were powerful, they were alone, they were widowed or single or whatever they were, and they were in a sort of pitched battle with the king, kind of by proxy, for the soul of the girl. Which is why I really like this Maleficent movie.
Yes,
I don't know if you've seen it, but
yes,
I really appreciated that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think Disney is trying, maybe.
Well, I don't know. Was it a Disney movie? It was Angelina Jolie.
Yes, it was Angelina. It wasn't Disney. Well, we've been having a fabulous conversation, and hopefully we've given everybody in the room lots of seeds to sort of cultivate, but also many other questions you have, because this is a book really about media and popular culture. So for you who are, many of you sort of saturated in the sort of contemporary scene, popular cultural scene, please, you'll have lots of questions. So this is your time to ask Carina anything you wish, curiosity, pushing from some of the themes that we've brought up, so on and so forth, because we've offered many provocations.
At one point,
I'll run around giving the microphone.
you said at one point that the culture was kind of moving from slut shaming to like being sex positive. And I guess my question is, like, I feel like that's kind of a dialectic. Like, I feel like, at least where I've grown up and being in college, I feel like they both exist.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't, I'm not one of the, I don't really believe that people talk about the progress that we make, and I think we do kind of go in circles, and I think that these things exist at the same time, and we do have all these mixed messages.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, did I butt into the middle of the question?
I guess I was just, it didn't feel like a clear, like a linear progression. To me, it feels like we're like stuck between it.
I
like,
agree.
with both?
I agree, and I think that one of the most interesting things to me is that, and one of the most frustrating things for me is that I feel like, like I said, I thought I was part of the first post-feminist generation. I thought that there was nothing really standing in my way, and it really took, I think 20 years of living in the world to understand that that wasn't true, but I could see how the same story is told to people 20 years younger, and how that's how we stay in the same place, because there is this encouraging of, like, again with the older, the evil witch or whatever, is like sort of like the young women are very much encouraged to align themselves with sort of existing power structure and to say, well, it's different now. But it kind of never is different now. But you don't, it's the only way that you see it is through experience. And so by the time it fully sinks in, you're not in that position anymore of being being young.
Thank you, Carina. I've just started your book. I'm very excited to finish it.
Thank you.
Just a general thought I had is there's so much sort of in the media now about empowerment of girls, of women, et cetera. And I've talked a little bit about my students about how that's often leveraged, often in a very corporatized way, to kind of convince girls, and I see a parallel with the Disney films, that they're being empowered. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that, and if you do see any maybe leveraging of it by a corporation, but actually in a way that is enacting change, like the whole strong is the new pretty, or how are those messages translating, do you think?
Yeah, there's a neologism, right? There's what's empowertainment or empowertizing. I think, not long ago I was at H&M with my daughter, and she was like, "Look, Mommy, here's a shirt for you," and it said "Feminist." I was like, "Oh, great."
This is what a feminist looks like. Yeah.
So I don't know. It's funny too, because I feel like this happened before. This has happened before, and part of the reason I wanted to write this book was because, I start when I'm 6 years old. And it's sort of a feminist moment, and a lot of the media that I'm watching is very informed by this, and especially children's media in the 70s. And then there's a huge backlash that kind of stays backlashed until I'm like 22 or something, and then it's like, right, girls, yeah, and then we do it again. And then it kind of backlashes again until my daughter's 6. And I was like, whoa. This is kind of like, these circles are really clear. And I mean, this pendulum swing is really dramatic. And I'm seeing so many parallels between, say, now and 1993 or whenever. And in those days, that's like when the women's market was discovered. And suddenly you had big yogurt and pink power tools, and there was a sort of this idea that, like, we can sell this to women, and it's very combined. And I can't say that it's not bad in some ways. Obviously, it's part of it is recognition, but it's a little bit mixed. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on this? On empowertizing?
Sorry. I have too many thoughts. So I'll just say that, again, I'm not a scholar of popular culture in the US for sure, but I work from the global South, right? And so the empowerment, the word has been used in our neoliberal moment to actually sell a particular kind of victimhood of sort of third world women, for instance, quote unquote, through that, right? Sort of give your money to those poor third world women because we want to empower them. So when I heard that question, I was like, there's something going on here within the logic of capital.
Or buy
right?
this
Which is
$5
really
shirt at H&M that was produced by
in
6-year-old
Bangladesh
girl.
by in a garment factory,
in a garment
right?
factory. So it's
I
complicated.
think the sort of, what is that? Empowertainment?
Empowerizing.
Yeah, like that's so blatant. Right,
It's so
and so
blatant.
obvious what's going on. But what's going on insidiously, transnationally, is that that term is used, girls and women's empowerment. Like whenever I see that, I flag it. Because I'm like, who is the outfit who's doing this? What really is being sold here?
That's really
What's
what it
being
comes
sold
down
is
to.
an image of some kind of rural women in the so-called third world, right? Who we feel good about saving. So,
Yeah,
so
or
that's
even,
another twist.
or even I think women in the first world, like it's something is being sold. I think to me that's what something's being sold regardless of lots of things are being sold or they're being sold to lots of different people, but it's a certain type of thing that's being sold, and that's the only reason that it's happening is because it's making money for companies that
Right.
Well, I mean, if it's making money
Or
for
charities.
Disney, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated kind of circuitry of capitalism,
Yeah.
right, that's going on. Yeah.
Hello, thanks for coming. I just have a question. I see a lot of girl-on-girl bullying in TV and film. Where do you think we get these kind of messages from? Like, for instance, Mean Girls, the movie.
Yeah. Oh, that's like a big thing for me, and it's. I have to say, like, even as someone who is aware of all these things, like, it's really hard to keep your 6, 8, 7, 9-year-old away from that stuff. And almost all the programming that's made with girls in it is this kind of bizarre, like, social dynamics programming. It's very much like she's the smart one, she's the pretty one, she's the this, she's the that, and they hate it, and they're mean to each other. And it's something that that it's really upsetting, actually, and I hate it. And I hate that my daughter likes to watch that stuff, and we have like talks about it, and it's hard because at that age kids aren't that sophisticated about media criticism. She's like, why don't you like it? I like it. I'm like, I don't want to say your show is bad. I know you like it. So but I think that it's a really it's a very common thing, and it's like part of this idea of like dividing women. That's why I'm really sensitive to all these narratives about dividing women and how women should hate each other and how they should hate each other because they belong to different groups or they're different ages or whatever. I think that it doesn't help us. It's what keeps us. It's all about keeping us out of power.
Yeah. But I wonder about this sort of the social messaging around bullying, right? That this is a form of power you can access, right? Back to the sort of question of empowerment, but in a negative kind of way that works for patriarchy and misogyny, right? Because if they're fighting with each other and bullying each other, someone else is laughing all their way to the bank, right? In a sense.
Yeah, it's a little gladiatorial.
Yeah, it is gladiatorial and masculinist.
Yeah.
Right, as well. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.